Okay, so it's Nairn here again with End Poverty Regina. I've got Andrew Stevens here. He's talking about the rental housing supplement and how the provincial government has playing a little fast and loose with some facts that are way out of context and just don't apply to the Regina situation. So we're going to talk a little bit about the housing situation for low-income people in Regina. Welcome, Andrew, and the camera around. Oops, there you are. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks a lot for taking this issue on. I think it's really important.
Okay, so the rationale given for ending the housing supplement was that vacancy rates are up. Can you give us a little context on that?
Well, I'm a bit concerned that the government would really gloss over the realities facing hundreds, if not thousands, of households in Saskatchewan and specifically in the major cities. And they should be a bit more sincere to the data that they produce, as well as the housing data that's coming from CMHC and other sources. So what they're doing is equating vacancy rates with affordability. Absolutely, there is some connection here in terms of the supply and demand, but they're really not digging into the story here. And if you're trying to change social assistance policies, you need to dig a bit deeper. So for instance, if we look here in Regina, we'll see that the vacancy rates have certainly gone up significantly over the last 3, 4, and 5 years. We had a serious problem here in the thick of the boom years. But what we're seeing is that rent isn't going down at the pace of vacancy rate increases. So in other words, if we're seeing vacancy rates climb, we're not seeing rent dip at that same rate. In fact, if you look at the data, we're seeing a stagnation. So we've seen an upswing and rent was going up along with the vacancy rate for years. It's not looking like it's going to do anything but flatten off. In fact, CMHC doesn't predict a real meaningful decline for a couple of years. And then what that means for people that are low income or even middle income in this city, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be paying less. So we look at averages. It doesn't mean all of a sudden your landlord is going to be giving you a discount on your rent. So I think that's worthy of some investigation. I know, for instance, in my own family's experience, my mom lived in an apartment in Saskatoon where the landlord was issuing bonuses if you were to help find people who would move in. Her rent didn't go down, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going to see rent go continuously above for 2-bedroom apartments, above the $1,000 mark for quite some time.
So on assistance without the rent, a single person with 2 children gets a total of about $1,000 a month.
Well, if you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing, that's considered unaffordable. So if you're spending 80 to 90% of your income that you're receiving based on existing social assistance models, you do the math here. That's a crisis. If we look at affordability or unaffordability for renters in Regina, this is a staggering number, but almost half of renters in Regina face an unaffordable housing situation, about 45%. That is up from 2011 as vacancy rates went up along with it. Now, if we look at homeowners, it's about 11%, but that's not really getting better. And unaffordability is impacting about 22% of Regina households currently. So anyone who believes that the growth of new neighborhoods, of development, is magically creating this situation in which people are struggling less, I think someone needs to question those claims and where they're coming from.
Okay, all right. So with the lack of affordability, what about Regina housing? What's happening there with the social housing? I know that both the Social Services Minister and the Premier were recommending that we we take those up because the vacancy rates there are supposedly high.
Right. Well, I'd have my own questions, right? Certainly Sask Housing, as one of the largest landlords in this province, has an incredible role to play, and they've done a historically good job of dealing with non-market based housing, and for the most part the quality of their housing has been solid. But again, let's look at the facts in greater detail. I don't think it's fair to just use the general vacancy rate. So for example, in the seniors complexes owned by Regina Housing Authority that I frequently visited during the campaign, they would certainly cite residents, they would cite vacancy rates in the double digits. And that's kind of what the government's set of numbers suggests. But if we move outside of that and we look at families with several children, if we're looking at large families, especially if we're looking at the newcomer population, we're seeing the vacancy rate for some affordable housing units or models at 0%. So the government is not doing themselves a favor by glossing over the facts. We need to look at, okay, we have a double-digit vacancy rate. Okay, maybe that's across the board. But what about larger families? What about non-seniors? What about newcomers? We need to really dig into who's being affected by the housing pinch that is still a reality here.
And I guess at the urban level, at the municipality level, you're looking at neighborhoods.
Right.
I know in my neighborhood, Heritage, rates of overcrowding are about double what they are in the city. What do you imagine that's doing to the available housing stock?
Well, again, it's going to create more pressures on what's there. It's made worse by the fact that we don't see the pace of infill and densification in typically, economically disadvantaged areas. North Central and Heritage are good examples in the city of Regina. So we need to look at how city planning, infill targets, Regina Housing and Sask Housing stock, we need to look at that plus the housing supplement together and to figure out what does vacancy really mean on a neighborhood by neighborhood level. And I think municipalities are incredibly sensitive to that. And the data that we see at the civic level is very different than what the data looks like at the provincial level, or at least at the political level when they start talking about why they cut back the supplement. So certainly I would suspect that we're going to see matters made worse in the lowest income neighborhoods, and that's something that will affect cities and city councilors most directly. As a side note, I will say the most common non-municipal policy issue that I hear about from residents has to do with different forms of support mechanisms that should be offered by the provincial government, SED and income for folks with disabilities. And I think I'm going to hear about this now as a councillor in terms of the housing supplements being clawed back. So it's going to be that civic leader at the community level. We're going to see the reality and we're going to see the problems face to face. And I worry that the government's still going to rest on these generalized figures that they're using to rationalize clawing back these supplements. I worry about that.
Okay, and so you're seeing firsthand the personal impacts that the loss of this supplement is having as a city councillor, and you're seeing the neighborhood impacts already.
Well, to be fair, I'm not seeing that directly. I mean, I'm seeing already inequality. I'm seeing poverty, and I'm seeing the realities in certain communities. I'm not sure I'm going to see the supplement impact right away, but I suspect I will be hearing from residents about this. And that's a sad thing. This might not affect people in the first month or even the first 6 months. This might affect people further down the road. So I think we're really looking at the legacy or the long-term impact of clawing back these supplements. And right now, none of the data I've seen about housing affordability would say, yeah, let's get rid of this. So I'm not seeing it directly at this point, but I suspect we're going to see an issue made worse if we're removing the support structure for already economically marginalized and really the poorest of the residents in our communities.
Yeah. Now you did in when we were talking about this. And I would like some clarification. you were saying vacancy rates are indeed up, but it's for a certain level of housing. So affordable housing, you were saying the vacancy rates are near zero. Can you clarify that?
Well, if I were to really hone in on the type of housing, affordability and affordable housing that is, within the purview of Sask Housing and the local housing authority. So I think affordable housing is a term that's used a bit too loosely. So it's housing that costs less than 30% of a household income, right? So, and that's not the housing authority buildings are, to my understanding, are not included in the CMHC data. So there's affordable housing generally, and there are general statistics around vacancy rates. But if we're talking about social and affordable housing, that's managed as affordable housing, not just based on how it relates to market pressures and market rates based on income. Dedicated affordable housing units that should be seen as separate from the overall vacancy rates.
Okay. So, I'm also your role in the homelessness initiative. What kind of impact are you going to see there?
Well, I think people need to understand, and this is something that I'm really grasping with now based on the engagement I've done with the community-based organizations as well as the consultants that are leading this project, is homelessness is a symptom, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just a phenomenon that stands alone by itself. It is a product of different issues in society. It can be a product of housing unaffordability. It can be a problem of unaddressed mental health issues or support structures. It could be caused by the lack of support for youth, for typically women who are fleeing from abusive relationships. So there's all sorts of reasons why homelessness exists. I can't see this helping the matter. I'm a bit concerned that as the city of Regina, as well as Saskatoon, starts to craft their own municipal-focused strategy, and as we're trying to get different partners at the table, this isn't helping matters, right? And one thing that was made clear to me is that you should look at episodic and chronic forms of homelessness at the base of an inverted pyramid, and at the top you have thousands of individuals who are potentially prone to becoming homelessness. This has a lot to do with how income is distributed. This has to do with living wages or the lack thereof, other forms of social support structures, income supplements. So you start chiseling away at the existing safety net of people, and potentially you add more numbers to the potentially homeless population. So I think the short of it is, if we're going to take homelessness seriously in the community, we have to look at preventing it as well. Right? We can't just wait for it to be a problem. We can't wait for the homeless population to increase, which, by the way, grew along with economic